මඩපාර දැන් කොන්ක්‍රීට් පාරක්. මූලික වුණේ අම්පිටිය ඇල්ල ගම්මැද්ද සවිය සමිතිය. අතහිත දුන්නේ ගම්මැද්ද. නව වසරේ ජනතා අයිතියට.
Uncertainty is the most stressful feeling. Are you stressed when thinking about the country's economy, and does it put you on a ledge? We are no exception to that feeling. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is $500 million in ISB debt to pay or restructure. Sri Lanka decides on the 18th. To discuss all this and more, we've invited 5 individuals to our studios. That's 4 individuals right now at our studio in Colombo, as well as an individual from Zoom. Let me quickly introduce our guests to you this evening. Joining us this evening on the show are Mr. Rajendran Tyagaraja, Chartered Accountant, former Chairman of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce; Dr. Anurek Naika, former Chairman of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce; Suresh Shah, Chartered Accountant, former Chairman of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce; Vish Govindaswamy, Chairman of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce and Employees Federation of Ceylon, as well as Mr. Deva Rodrigo, former Chairman of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce and former member of the Monetary Board of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, joining us via Zoom. Let's start off tonight's show with Dr. Anurek Naika, former Chairman of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Firstly, thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation to discuss about Sri Lanka's current economic dilemma that we are facing at present. So let's starting off today's show. Dr. Ekanaka, you were on Face the Nation a couple of months ago, and you were very pessimistic about the country's economy and the way in which the central bank was handling state of affairs as far as the country's economy was concerned. Given today's context at the moment, are we still facing a similar crisis? If so, what is it?
Thank you, Samir. Let me first thank the organizers for inviting me to be here tonight. Couple of months ago, you in a similar session, I was posed the same issue, and the issue was whether we are having sufficient reserves to finance our imports and also meet the debt obligations. Now, I won't give you exact dates and amounts, but our reserve position has declined very rapidly from around $7 billion about 2 years ago to $1.5 billion at end of November. Now, $1.5 billion was not even sufficient for 1 month's imports. At the time we met last, we had more than that. So it has been declined month after month. In December, the Central Bank Weekly Report shows that our reserves are $3.1 billion. Interestingly, roughly $1.5 billion of that is a swap arrangement with China, which has been available for quite some time. But then in December, it appears that has been realized or converted, or whatever the word you use, and so we have $3.1 billion reserves. The problem we have is, again, according to the central bank numbers, during the year 2022, the current year, the total debt service obligations amounts to about $7.5 billion. Now, every month we import something like $1.6 billion and we export merchandise only about $1 billion worth of stuff. Now, part of that, so I'm giving rough numbers. We short then on trade account, say 600 million US dollars. Now, remittances used to be about 600 a month, and it kept on declining, and in November I think it was about $150 million. So even after the remittances, we are still short of perhaps $400 million a month. Now 400 into 12, right, is say $4 billion, $5 billion. So the huge gap, the amount of debt service we have and the shortfall in our import-export situation, even after taking services into account. So the balance of payments is going to be negative. Now, such a situation cannot be met by, properly addressed by a swap here, swap there. Anyway, swaps are short term. I think the Chinese arrangement is a 3-year one, as far as I've heard. Even the Indian support, which has been pledged and is being worked out, I understand, is about for $1.5 billion. So, the arithmetic, things don't add up. So, we are going to find it increasingly difficult to meet our essential import requirements for consumption as well as for businesses to run, for industries to add value. And that is a crisis.
Right. So right? Up until 2025, starting from 2021, Dr. Ekanaika, we have to pay $10 billion US in ISBs. Bilateral loan stands at 6.2 billion. Multilateral debt stands at 8.5 billion, which is approximately around 24 to 25 billion US dollars that we owe the world at the moment. However, right now, as we speak, we have 3.1 billion in our reserves at the moment. Why can't Sri Lanka or the government pay 500 million US dollars on the 18th of January? Why isn't it the most prudent decision to make at the moment as we speak?
It's a tough question. There are pros and cons on both sides. Now, if we don't pay $500 million to settle the dues on maturing ISBs, the concern is anyway we will then become a defaulter. So our rating, which is just above default, will drop to default, right? And when you have defaulted, until you have sorted out the matters with your lenders, commercial transactions are also going to be difficult, because particularly in supporting imports, the counterparties overseas will find it difficult to accept our documentation because they are not sure we will be able to settle later. And now, right now we have shortages in many things. We have gas shortages, we have milk powder shortage, some are talking of an imminent wheat flour shortage, and so on. And 1,500 plus containers apparently are stuck in the port awaiting clearance for want of exchange. Power cuts are being talked of. Crude oil is not coming, instead diesel, purified diesel, petrol are coming, right? So imagine what is going to happen in the coming months.
Why is it, Dr. Ekanaka, why is it that the government is so hell-bent in paying these $500 million US as their obligations at the moment? If you look at it, if you look at the past record of this government, don't you smell something fishy? Don't you smell some foul play in this business?
See, first I must point out to you, Shamir, it's not a question of a $500 million. It's a question of the entire debt pile, right? The entire debt pile as of today, what we are carrying now is about 82, 83 billion US dollars, right? All of that is not going to be fall due over the next 5 years. Some are long term, it will take some time. So it is about, when we talk of debt restructuring, we are not talking of just this 500 million which is due as a bullet payment in January. There's another bullet payment of $1 billion in July also. But in between, every month, there is an outflow of 300 million, 400 million kind of numbers as interest for different types of loans we have obtained, not only ISBs, right? So when we, even last time when we discussed this, when we say that restructuring is required, is for the entire debt pile. Of course, the direct focus will be on ISBs, which will be $13 billion or somewhere thereabouts. So it's important to bear that in mind. The issue is not just the bullet payment of $500 million. It's about the entire debt pile which requires to be restructured so that we can get a breather. We can even out the bulge over the next 5 years to some extent and make it possible for us to start honoring the debts. Now, we are not saying one should never pay debts. It's not that we are talking about. Restructuring is you reprofile so that the bulge can be reduced. Perhaps get a haircut.
Yeah, but do you smell something fishy here?
No, I'm merely puzzled because for lack of information. I'm merely puzzled by the fact that why there's a rush to settle debts without going in for restructuring.
Because Dr. Ekanaka, if you look at today's tweet by Governor Ajit Nivard Cabral, he sends a strong signal to individuals like you. He says, the individuals who screamed that Sri Lanka wouldn't be able to pay the January 2022 ISB maturity are now screaming that we shouldn't pay it when we are ready to make a payment. A direct attack to individuals like you. It seems that you're jealous of the government.
Samir, I don't take it that way. I'll tell you why. Neither myself or none of us here have focused on, $500 million bullet payment and said that it is not going to be, government is not going to be settled that. What you have said is that debt pile is so large, given the current status of the economy, that has to be restructured. So, I would not take
not that you're jealous of the government.
Any issue on, some others may have said it, I don't know who.
Not that you're jealous of the government, Dr. Ekanaka.
Sorry?
Not that you're jealous of the government.
No. There's nothing. We're talking of a national issue, not petty jealousies.
Because that's what the governor thinks. Now I move my attention to Mr. Rajendra Tyagaraja, chartered accountant, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce as well. Let's get some clarity on what debt restructuring is all about, Mr. Tyagaraja. We are talking about a principal haircut, which Dr. Ekanaka just spoke about a couple of minutes ago. Then we speak about coupon adjustments and then about maturity extension. What are all these three different components in debt restructuring? What does it really mean to the general public? who are watching this show tonight?
So the concept of a restructuring is, from a national point of view, for the principal borrower, which is the government, to go out to the various providers of this debt and negotiate a plan to repay in a manner which is acceptable to each of these classes of lenders, while at the same time giving the necessary breathing space for the nation to also come to grips with the current challenges, which are also not just only with this current forex. There are also some macroeconomic fundamental issues which the country has been facing, which have to be addressed. Namely, you have two issues on one side. We have historically for a number of years fallen short in our revenue collection. We have seen hemorrhage in revenue. For example, our tax to GDP is around 8%. Right? On the other hand, our expenditure, we have had a fairly significant amount of recurrent expenditure. The management of expenditure is a challenge and has been a challenge. So these are two areas we need to get to grips with from a more medium to permanent basis. So the breathing space to bring some policy reforms into place will be available if that negotiation takes place. Now that can take place in the form of the three different categories which you said.
There's a principal haircut, coupon adjustments, as well as maturity extensions.
Yes, and also the other area is, instead of only playing the principal, you can even have what they call a preemptive restructuring, where during a process of negotiation you only pay the interest while the principal is halted while you're negotiating. All this is various choices to create that breathing space.
But aren't we too late to move into something of this sort, that is the preemptive debt restructuring that you are talking about right now? Aren't we too late? We have just 8 more days to go as far as the $500 million ISB commitment is concerned. So aren't we too late to talk about preemptive debt restructuring?
I personally don't think so, because there are use cases world over in the last decade or so where countries have started that discussion even a few days before the due date of a particular instrument. Point one. The second thing is, personally, I am not here to prescribe what a policymaker who has been elected by the people should do or not. I'm only giving another school of thought which merits discussion. Now, in that discussion, even if a decision is taken to go ahead with this 500 in 7 days' time, what I am talking, I'm sure like the others here, is the bigger picture of the billion in July and a whole series of another 3 or 4 billion in the next per year over the next few years, to consider this as a alternate option, even if that does not work in the next 7 days. It's still not too late to evaluate the merits of it as an alternate option.
How long does the debt restructuring process usually takes, Mr. Tyagarajan? Because
so if there are various examples we can discuss. If I am not mistaken, the one which was, I think, the Ecuadorian one, was literally within 6 months. I think they started the discussion in March of a particular year, and by September they completed the process. Of course, during that period when they started the process, the ratings went down a couple of notches. We knew that, but there was certainty as to which direction that government was taking. And by the time the restructuring was completed, actually the ratings went up a couple of notches, and more importantly, the reserve position of the country had gone up, as well as in terms of number of months of imports, actually it had gone up. So actually the country itself had benefited by beefing up its reserves, and by doing so again got back into the market. So the whole issue is, it may have some short-term implications. My point is, already we have got into a situation where we are literally a notch below the RD. So how worse can you be at this stage, rather than exploring the possibility of doing something concrete which can in the short to medium term get us back into where we were perhaps 2 to 3 years ago.
Mr. Agaracha, why do countries fall into this debt trap? Because if you look at countries like Ecuador, for an example, Belize for that matter, Argentina, which has defaulted many times in the world, which is a classic example for a default the world over. If you look at countries like Venezuela, which is now discussing about debt restructuring going forward, we're talking about countries like Lebanon. Now we're talking about countries like Sri Lanka. What is the reason that countries like us fall into this debt trap? What is the reason behind it?
So I think there are a couple of reasons, different reasons for different countries to have gone to taken that route. I think from Sri Lanka's perspective, my limited understanding here has been over a certain period, I think the country has been living beyond its means. Effectively, we have been spending more than I think we can afford. And that boils down to two features: the revenue collection for the country and the amount of expenditure we have been spending. And the next question is, okay, expenditure is okay in spending if it is productive expenditure. To what extent is the unproductive element of it persisting? And those are two elements, I think, which one has to address consistently from a policy reform perspective if we are going to get to grips with it. Now, there are countries like Argentina, which you mentioned, where the tax to GDP was pretty high. I think it was almost 30%. But on the other side, against that, the extent of handouts, the social reforms, was far, far greater than that. So the affordability factor became a problem.
Mr. Agaracha, based on what you are trying to say, it seems that the people are responsible for this problem that we are facing at the moment. So it's not respective government's mistake that has put us into this chronic situation at the moment. It seems that the people are responsible. So is that the case?
So Shamir, it also depends on what governments do when there is more cash in the hands of people than what they need. For example, if you look at the last 2 years, 19 and 20, if you really see the amount of what they call M2, the money supply, against the GDP growth, which is adjusted for deflation, the amount of money which has now percolated or is circulating in the hands of the people is effectively, I believe, grown by almost 60%. And the question is, at this moment in time, is too much of money chasing too fewer goods at the situation where we also have a limited amount of foreign exchange, and in a country where we believe we should shift from a import-driven economy into a production-driven economy, when we are having this choice, and when we are also having an exchange rate which is sort of managed at a particular range, it is giving the people the freedom to demand for more and more imports.
Mr. Agaracha, you are being very careful when you're talking.
I mean objective.
Yeah, but don't you think the mismanagement of the governance structure in Sri Lanka over the years, because we saw in 2001 when the Ranil Wickremesinghe administration was finding difficult to breathe in terms of its debt obligations, we were almost on the verge of bankruptcy. And then the Ranil Wickremesinghe administration went and signed a peace deal with the LTTE and was able to get a lot of foreign loans to cushion and muscle our country's economy. In 2008, when the global recession took place, in 2009, we went again to the international community and asked for help, and they helped us. But this government seems to be very steadfast in their approach. Their answer to the current problem is very, very steadfast, very autocratic, very dictatorial, and very pessimistic in terms of the country's future. Don't you think so?
2001 was a situation where, again, let us remind ourselves, when we were still classified as a low-income country. Let's be mindful. And obviously, we benefited from a lot of bilateral and concessional credit. Come 2008-9, when the per capita almost crept towards that $4,000, we lost that status and we became a middle or a lower middle income country. And when that happened, naturally, a number of those concessional facilities cease. And once that happens, naturally Sri Lanka had every incentive to go into the markets. And that's what we did in the late 2000s. And once you go into the market, and we all have an aspiration to go up the curve, it's only fair that you look at continuing the journey rather than reverting back into become a low-income country.
But that has happened already.
It has.
Yeah.
So it's never too late to, try to understand the root causes and make some corrections.
But don't you think the government should take a much more soft approach to this problem? Because look at the government policy, Mr. Tyagaraja. Now, Mr. Ajit Niwal Cabral is of the opinion that we won't restructure our debt. We won't go for reprofiling of our debt. We will pay the $500 million on the 18th of this month. Yesterday, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa is requesting the Chinese foreign minister for debt restructuring. Now, what is the policy of the government? There seems to be no policy. So you are trying to somewhat hold a candle to the government and say everything is well, everything is hunky-dory. The problem right now we are facing has to be overcome by the people itself. Is that a fair judgment?
I think my perspective is it's not only governments, people also have to be realistic and objective and responsible. But in the case of a government, I think it's the government who has to take a decision eventually as to how they will manage the economy of the country. My point is there is merit in always looking at an alternate solution. There's always options.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Rajendra Tyagaraja, Chartered Accountant, former Chairman of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. We now move our attention to Suresh Shah, Chartered Accountant, former Chairman of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce as well. Suresh, nice to have you on Face the Nation tonight. Now, why must countries like Sri Lanka engage with the IMF to restructure the debt? Can't we do without the IMF? Because if you look at countries like Belize, in the last 15 years, they have restructured their debt 4 times and they've not gone to the IMF. They've done it on their own accord. Can't countries like Sri Lanka also resolve to a similar pattern or a similar system?
Thank you, Shamir. Good to be here. Technically, yes, you can. I mean, we are speaking here about a debt restructuring, and it does not necessarily need the assistance of the IMF to do the debt restructuring. I think you can do it on your own, like you just pointed out. There are instances where that has happened, but it's a complex process because there are many. If you take the ISBs, for example, there are many. It's a very specialized process. So always good to get people who know, who understand, who've gone through the process before, the people with the experience to assist you do that. And where you really need the IMF is not really to restructure the debt, but once you restructure the debt, you got to give your creditors, in this case the bondholders, some kind of assurance that at some point in time in the future that you will meet the commitments that you have made in the restructuring process, right? So the IMF comes in to kind of underwrite a plan that you may have put forward and said, look, here is how we are going to get our economy back on stream, and it is because we do these things with our economy that we are going to be able to repay you, right? And the IMF comes in to kind of underwrite that plan and give a level of confidence to the creditors whose debt has now been restructured, that yes, these people who today can't meet their full obligations will actually do so maybe 3 years down the road or 4 years down the road or whatever it may be. So the real, so that's one of the reasons why you would need the IMF, right? Another reason why you would need the IMF is when Anura and Tia both spoke of the need to have some kind of headspace. There are certain things that you need to do to get the economy on stream. That's not going to happen in 1 month or 6 months. It's going to take a few years. So you need a little bit of breathing space. And the IMF comes with a funding facility, right? In Sri Lanka's case, I think we should be able to get something like $3 billion, $1 billion a year over a 3-year period. It comes at a fairly concessionary rate of interest, around 1%, if I'm not mistaken.
0.1.
It's around 1, I think. Anyway, okay. But concessionary. And also you can get long-term money. I think it's between 5 to 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. So what it does is during the period that you're rebalancing your economy, getting your economy back on stream, you get that headspace. And also with the IMF, what will also happen probably, now the IMF comes to you with balance of payment support, right? But what you will also get is the World Bank and the ADB, for instance, again coming in with not concession, but low interest funding. Again, maybe 5 to 10 year funding, and they will come with budgetary support. Both Anura and Thia again spoke of fiscal deficits. We've run chronic fiscal deficits for years. So they will also come with budgetary support to help us on the fiscal side, right? So these are the advantages that you get when you go in for an IMF program. But like you rightly said, it's theoretically not necessary, but I think practically it's a good thing to have.
Suresh, now we've gone to the IMF 16 times. However, this time around, we're shying away from the IMF. If you look at the statement from the governor, if you look at the statement from the Minister of Finance, you see them projecting a different picture about the IMF to the general public. So the people are of the opinion, if you go to the IMF, there will be taxes imposed. There will be austerity measures. We will have to tighten our belts. So it has become a political gimmick right now. Why are we shying away from going to the IMF?
So, Shamir, I mean, at the end of the day, the IMF will advise you to run your economy well. Okay, I mean, so they will want you to run your economy in a disciplined manner. So there is no gainsaying where that is concerned. But having said that, this whole bogey of the IMF that is being put forward right now, I find it a little bit surprising for this reason. These austerity measures that you spoke of, right? So if you think about it right now, our fuel prices have increased. Now, I'm sure the IMF would have advised us to do that, right? The fertilizer subsidy is effectively taken off, and I'm sure the IMF would have wanted us to restructure that fertilizer subsidy. Government has committed, if you read the finance minister's budget speech, the government has committed to reducing the fiscal deficit. Now the IMF would have said, do that, right? We've taken price controls away. So the IMF would have advised us to gradually take price controls out of the system. So the government, in my mind, is actually doing a lot of things that the IMF would have advised us to do. So I really don't understand why the government is saying, look, if we go to the IMF, things are going to get worse. Because we seem to be anyway doing the stuff that the IMF would have told us to do. And the difference is that if we actually go to the IMF, we'll get the funding. Now we are doing all these things without getting the funding. So that's really surprising.
Suresh, now you said something very interesting. You say that the IMF will put us on a disciplinary track, make sure that we are on a right track to manage our own economy. Are you trying to tell me, Suresh, that the current governor and the Minister of Finance, who several parliamentarians dubbed as the man with 7 brains, can't do the job?
See, Shamir, it's nothing to do with the current government. Yes, I mean, the current government has its ups and downs as well. Yeah. But I think this problem, it goes back to the time from, it's been there since the time of independence. So let's not blame one party. I mean, yes, this government's responsible. The last government has been responsible. The government before that has been responsible. And all the governments have fundamentally mismanaged the economy. And let me tell you why. Shamir, I mean, if you take a household, okay, you know that there is a point beyond which your expenditure cannot be more than your income. Right? I mean, you can do it for a month, 2 months, 6 months. Can you do it for 5 years? Unlikely. But if you take Sri Lanka, our expenditure has been more than our income for something like 70 out of our 74 years since independence. Right? And if you take on the external side, if you take on the current account, I think for something like 72 of our 74 years since independence, we've had a deficit on our current account, which means our currency inflows have been less than our currency outflows, right? We know this is not sustainable. So let's not pinpoint one side. I think every government that has governed this country has been responsible to bring us to this point.
The Sri Lankan economy, Suresh, has always been very resilient. If you look at the last few years, the last few decades, we've always come on top as far as the country's economy is concerned. Are you trying to tell me that there is no hope now?
I don't really agree with you when you say that the country's economy has come on top. I mean, if you take
If you look at 2008, 2009, when there was a global financial crisis, Sri Lanka managed the country's economy, went with the IMF, we got some support, and we came on top. 2010, 2011, we were able to attract a lot of foreign direct investments as well to the country. That went to a all-time low subsequently. That's a different story altogether, but we've always been a resilient nation.
So it all depends on which benchmark you use. So if you look at yourself yesterday versus today,
right,
and you might feel that yes, yesterday's Polla together is today a tiled roof house. Yeah, you've moved forward. But when you compare yourself against your comparator countries, like take for example, countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand. I'm not even thinking about Singapore. I mean, don't forget Singapore, 1965. Prime Minister Lee felt that Singapore was a kind of a basket case at that time, and see where Singapore is today, right? So if you look at Sri Lanka versus our comparator countries, I would say that we've even gone backwards, because let me put it this way. At the time we got independence in 1948, in Asia we were second only to Japan, right? On many numbers, okay? But today that's not the case. Countries like Bangladesh, who came into being so many years after Sri Lanka, right? You can see them catching up. Countries like Vietnam, you can see them catching up and even maybe going beyond us. So I think if you look at us versus our comparator countries, I would say we've even gone backwards.
Right. There were times, Suresh, if you may recollect right, I was not even born, but J.R. Jagardhan said that we will export electricity to countries like India. But right now we are experiencing 2 hours of power cut, unfortunately. Whether or not it's economic mismanagement or whether or not the government is governing the country is a big question mark that we are experiencing at the moment. But that's for another debate altogether. I now move my attention to Deva Rodrigo, who's joining us via Zoom, who's also the former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, former member of the Monetary Board of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Nice to have you on board, Deva. Right. Are you surprised? Now, you were a former member of the Monetary Board of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Are you surprised Governor Cabral taking such a, I would say, a bold step to pay our debt obligations when we are scraping the barrel for foreign dollars? Are you surprised?
I'm not surprised, but if I put my cap as my hat as an accountant, we get into this kind of situation in companies. And before you hit rock bottom, causing pain to multiple stakeholders, you go for a restructuring. The country situation is also similar to that. We can pay this 500, no doubt. Then comes another 1 billion, as Anuru said, in July this year. And in between, with the deficit in the current account, how far can we go? Some say April, some say June. I mean, we don't want to be pessimistic or negative and make matters more difficult to those who are in the seat of governance. But if we look at the 500 million payment, to me it looks the best course of action is to negotiate and restructure. Maybe it's too late, we are just a week to that date. If we had done it a month earlier, we would have done better. Because that
why would any lending organization be okay to restructure the debt? Now, if why would any lending organization be okay to restructure the debt? Now, if take me as an individual, if I have given a debt to someone, I would want to collect that debt on time. So why would I be okay with it? Why would any lending organization be okay to restructure debt? It doesn't go in their favor.
All right. It is in their favor if we can go up with a proposal to say, if they give us that space and time, we will put our house in order with those reforms that would come and then be able to repay the debt. may not be the full debt with a capital reduction, as they call a haircut, or the coupon rate adjustment, which is a reduction in the interest rate, or the maturity date. So, or any such combination, or all of it. So the lender will see a benefit to themselves than allowing the thing to crash. Now, in companies in Sri Lanka, under the Companies Act, which is simple compared to the running of the country, at a particular point when your assets deplete to half the capital because of losses, the directors are obliged to call an extraordinary general meeting and lay before the members a plan. First to explain why it has happened, then a plan for recovery. Now, that plan would involve very often a restructuring of debt as well, and telling the banks and other lenders, you have to take a share of this, you have taken a risk, yes, we are in this situation, but if you do, then we'll be able to recover and go ahead. And for that recovery, we'll do X, Y, Z. We will cut down waste, we might sell off a loss-making business unit, we might change managers, and so on. So then the lenders would be happy to agree to those terms of reducing the amount that they would are legally obliged to get, because otherwise they may not get anything.
So Deva, what happens if the lenders are not agreeable?
That's where I believe the negotiations come, and there are mechanisms. I believe that's where the IMF and others come in, where there are, the Argentine case that was discussed. The IMF told the lenders how much of haircut they have to take. I think it was some $50 billion that the IMF lent to them. That's a much big economy. So those lenders are themselves not deciding on their own, but the other international agencies, I only quote IMF as one example, will be able to use the strong arm tactics and get them to do it, because it's in the interest of everybody and the country as well.
Yes.
That's where the IMF interest is.
So Dev, I want to take your attention back to a country like Greece in 2010 when the IMF stepped in, because Greece looked for help from the EU countries, and the EU did support Greece for a few years because it being a member state, and there was ample cushioning as far as their debt restructuring was concerned, but then the IMF came to help Greece. However, the Greece scenario was not the best example for debt restructuring and how a country would have survived, because this was very evident from a statement that was made by the IMF country head, even at that time, saying that they have already made mistakes in a country like Greece when it came to their debt restructuring program. So why must Sri Lanka fall into that trap as well? Well, that is what the government is saying as well. They don't know the country's economics. They don't know the country's internal structures. They don't know how the country works. They don't know what a resilient nation we are. Henceforth, there is no reason for us to go to the IMF.
It's not that. Look at the state in which we are. We are having a huge shortage in foreign currency, to the extent that they announced power cuts of 2 or 2.5 hours a day. And if I take power cuts alone, that could affect industrial production. Those manufacturers won't be able to meet the deadlines promised. When the deadlines are not met, they will be blacklisted, and next time the whole country will be bypassed by them. So the destruction that will come to Sri Lanka just by the power cut is enormous. But why does it happen? Because we are short of foreign exchange. So it is not that we are going to the IMF for something that we would not require, but we are in, I would say, dire straits that way. So it is better to go to the IMF and look for a total package, as I think Suresh said, it's not just one debt. This bond that is coming up for payment on the 18th, but the whole portfolio of it in the next maybe 5 years taken together. What about the July payment due 1 billion? Will we have money to do that? Okay, somebody might say we can borrow from friendly countries. That's what we have been doing, but those are patchwork arrangements.
Governor Ajit Niwar Kabral, of course, Deva, would disagree with you because he's been very optimistic about the country's economy. When everyone said that the country's economy is only having 1.4 billion in its reserves, within days, the governor was able to bring the number to 3.1 billion. And he said by the end of the year, we will have that money. So if Governor Kabral was watching the show, he might think that you are looking at him very pessimistically.
I'm not sure whether I'm pessimistic. Maybe he can say that, he's entitled to say that. But the country situation today, I think, would demand trying to save this 500 million and release it to the banks or to get the imports that are so urgent, vital for the country, especially fuel, maybe medicine.
So Deva, when you said that we have to put our house in order, when Suresh said that we have to be more disciplined in the way we approach, when Mr. Tyagaraja said that we have to have a very good approach, we have to look at alternatives, when Dr. Anureka Nayaka mentioned that we have to look at the alternatives and look at an opportunity to restructure our debt because we are in dire needs, I am beginning to think that we are in this situation because of chronic financial mismanagement that has taken place over the years, and in particularly during the last 2 years. Do you agree?
I would quite subscribe to the view of particularly the last 2 years, because we had a very poor balance sheet to start with. But the last 2 years, there was this added problem of the COVID situation, which you all know. The economy was completely closed down for so many months, twice over. So it only would have aggravated the situation, brought us to this position faster than otherwise. But my view is, if we don't act now, in another 4 months, 5 months, we might grind to a dead halt.
Right.
And that will be much more damaging.
Right. Thank you very much, Deva Rodrigo, former chairman of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce and former member of the Monetary Board of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. I have a lot of questions to pose to all 5 gentlemen today, but I would not let go of Vish Govindaswamy, who is the current chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, as well as the Employees Federation of Ceylon. Vish, why are we facing this crisis at the moment? What is the reason behind it? Many might say, and probably would bank on the fact that COVID-19 was the key issue that we faced in Sri Lanka during the last 2 years. As a result of that, tourism came to a grinding halt. However, I'm looking at it from a different perspective altogether. Let's look at the fertilizer crisis that happened in Sri Lanka. May 2021, the government took a steadfast decision, haphazard, illogical thinking as far as the fertilizer crisis in Sri Lanka was concerned. The ban was lifted in October. At that time, the fertilizer prices had gone up and skyrocketed at the moment. What is the reason behind this? When the private sector looks at you as a chamber to be their voice, what is the message you have for the government?
Thank you, Samir. I think good question. I think going back to the first question that you alluded, why are we in this current position? I think COVID definitely has an issue behind our revenues. I mean, this is the 3rd year in a row. I think we are suffering from the revenues coming from our mainstay, which is the the tourism. And we have also suffered from the incomes coming from our remittances. And I think Dr. Kanaik explained it has really come down. In explaining of the government's decision on the fertilizer, the government has the right to make whatever decision they made. But I think from the private sector, we have lobbied again and again and said, while we are for reducing chemical fertilizer over time, right? I think, in terms of, natural carbon reduction of gases, etc., it's the right thing to do over a period of time, but we need to do it, in a phased out manner. It can't be done overnight because we are going to have serious crop losses. We have made that. I think as a private sector, a joint chamber paper was submitted to the government saying that, we are supporting your cause, but, give it a little time. Then maybe we can work out a plan together as to, which are the fertilizers that is overused, why it is overused, and how can we reduce it. And at the same time, the back end, if you want to use organic fertilizer, you have to first manufacture organic fertilizer, and you need to have a base stock that you can distribute. So these were all discussed in length, but policies are policies, so we are facing the consequences, unfortunately.
The government is ill-advised?
I can only speak for the private sector. We have advised as a joint chamber, all the chambers coming together.
Let me rephrase that question.
Yeah.
Does the government listen to you and take you all seriously?
I think so. I mean, there is no question of not listening. We are given a hearing whenever we want. I don't think there is no question of hearing us. But I guess, the government also makes its own decisions, and they feel fit those decisions are correct. But then we as the private sector also have the right to go and speak to the government and say, we don't agree. This is our stance, and this is what we think is the right thing to do. So sometimes there are lots of things that we have said and they have heard and made changes. On some things they don't. So we are not again speaking about this particular government versus any government. It's always the case.
Wish now, all 5 gentlemen who are joining us on the show, most of you are also working in the private sector of Sri Lanka as well, and holding top positions in your respective fields. My question to you is, why does the government procrastinate to go in for debt restructuring? Is it something cultural? Because I'm sure the masses of Sri Lanka who are at the grassroots don't understand what is going on when we speak about debt restructuring, debt profiling, a haircut, or coupon adjustments or maturity extensions. The grassroots people don't understand. But the government is procrastinating its decisions. Why? Is it cultural?
I don't know whether it's cultural, but I think it's to do with, in my opinion, again, it's probably to do with protecting your image, that you come across as a nation that couldn't meet your obligations. Therefore, you try to some or other meet your obligations, and then there is a point in which, I'm sure a year ago, looking at it a year ago, I'm sure things didn't look this bad, right? Because everybody thought COVID came and COVID was going to go away after the first phase. Nobody expected a second phase. Nobody expected a third phase. I don't think a month ago nobody expected Omicron, right? So, these things just spiral out. When things spiral out, things become difficult than what you originally hoped for. These things happen in even private businesses. Private businessmen sometimes think that they can get out of problems without facing it head on.
But what I don't understand is, Vish, let's take a look at the state banks in Sri Lanka. When private companies cannot afford to pay them, private companies go to these state banks, go to banks and tell them, help us restructure our debt. And there have been instances that these debts sometimes have been written off by state banks in Sri Lanka. They've helped the private sector over the years. Why is it that the government doesn't understand the simple mechanics behind this? If you can't pay, go to the international obligators and tell them, we can't pay it. Why don't they understand this simple arithmetic thinking or the logical argument?
I don't think it's only the state banks, even private banks. Whenever
Absolutely.
a customer reaches out and they're in trouble, that's when you differentiate, the banker who you're banking with, right? When you need a bank or an organization more when you're in trouble than when you're doing well. It's the same thing for a country. When these things, I have said this. I don't think Sri Lanka as a country should blame itself for, the whole pandemic. Pandemic didn't come because of Sri Lanka made it happen. So you can't blame yourself, right? You can't blame yourself for the remittances not coming in. I mean, the current shipping rates and our exports have been really struggling to get out because of the whole shipping issues around the world, right? Shipping has gone through the roof. We have not been able to meet a lot of our export obligations. So there is a worldwide issue. So I think the government needs to relook at and say, okay, we tried, there's nothing wrong in what we did. We tried to meet our obligations, we couldn't. And I think maybe we should relook at other alternatives. Going to the IMF may be one solution. You said it before, right? There are countries who have done it without IMF. And we also don't need to go into IMF and put our hand up and say help. I think we have enough economists within Sri Lanka who are well versed to put a plan together and submit to IMF and say, this is what we want to do. Right? So, we know these things is what we can do. And therefore, help. And that doesn't mean we need to embrace any austerity measures that they're going to shove upon us.
Right. So forget about the government protecting its image in front of the public in Sri Lanka, which if there is no food or pharmaceutical products that can be imported to the country, the government will lose its face and will fall or put the people from the frying pan into the fire. So that danger is still there. So, Vish, what is the danger that we have when we use our reserves to pay or honor our international ISBs? What's the danger that we possess?
No, because then when your reserves dwindle down, you have no reserves left to fund. We spoke about the monthly deficits that we are running, right? To a tune of 600 million. So where is those gaps going to come from, right? Unless we have a fantastic FDIs that we can come up with in the next year or two, even that is not enough. Or we can speed up our exports to a rate that we can do. But all those things can be done, if we sort out our immediate issues and look after the public at large and elevate some of these pains that people are going through, and then work towards, correcting like the revenue collection, that needs to be corrected rather quickly than later, right? The country needs to have enough revenue to look after its expenses. That's as basic as it gets.
So knee-jerk decisions taken by the government yet again in terms of paying this $500 million US dollars on the 18th of this month, if they go ahead and pay it.
See, I think the 500 million is, whether it happens or not, it's up to the policymakers. I think we are here today to talk about the long term. You spoke about a 25 billion debt that's outstanding between 21 to 25, right? I think that's a bigger picture than this 500 million.
Yeah, because out of that debt, just to correct you, Vish, 8.5 billion are multilateral debt.
Yeah, which can
that doesn't necessarily have to be restructured, or you can't restructure that.
But that
because
can be
is coming from the
negotiated.
IMF or ADB or the World Bank.
Those can be negotiated.
Before. Yeah. Right. But the problem is that 17 billion that we have to pay to the ISBs as well as the bilateral loans that we've already obtained. So I want to open the floor for questions from our journalists. Took some time to get some clarity on the subject that we are at the moment. ISBs and whether we should restructure our debt and move forward as a nation. We are in conversation with Vish Govindaswamy, Rajendran Tyagaraja, Suresh Shah, Dr. Anurek Naika, as well as Deva Rodrigo. I open the floor for questions. On to my immediate right is Nadim Majid. On to my immediate left is Zeenat Musafir. Let's start off with Zeenat. Nadim, yes.
Thank you, Shamir. My question is to Mr. Tyagaraja. Mr. Tyagaraja, so when we talk about debt restructuring or reprofiling, how will it affect our banks? Because our banks have invested heavily in ISBs, SLDBs, and even the domestic debt, treasury bills and treasury bonds. So how will it affect our banking system?
So, Zeenat, as at today, if we look at the total pool of ISBs and Sri Lanka development bonds outstanding, the quantum of ISBs and SLDBs held by Sri Lankan banks amounts to around 3.7 billion, of which approximately 2.3 billion represents SLDBs and 1.4, give or take, represents the ISBs. Right? So first of all, if we look at the balance sheets of the banks, and if we go through a reprofiling exercise, which probably, assuming that by doing so we probably run the advantage of avoiding a possible future problem or eventual default eventually. I'm not saying it will happen in January. The merits of that is over another 5-year period, the banks will have a better chance to make sure that they get their money back. And this is particularly important because today, when we look at how these banks account for these bonds, most of the foreign banks or the foreign holders tend to typically mark their portfolios to market based on the market price of the instruments, regardless of whatever challenge. So what they have in their portfolios reflect any discounts, and the volatility of price is factored in. But what I think happened in Sri Lanka over the past 2 years, and this I think was the case for also Sri Lankan banks in general, but I believe when the pandemic faced us, the Sri Lankan banks predominantly took the option. I think they worked with the accounting policymakers and had a one-off exemption to change, to re-examine their business model. And in that process, I believe most of the private banks, the Sri Lankan banks, took a decision to treat their bond portfolios away from marking to market the portfolios into what they call amortizing over the period of the tenor of the bond. So if the bond, say, is a 5-year instrument, they decided their model is now going to change and they would look at holding it and spreading it over 5 years.
Right.
Now by doing that, the model of accounting for any provisioning of potential losses works on this Basel Committee principles, and there that model has 2 elements. One is the probability of a default, and then you call a loss given default. And when you look at that combination, the typical formula is 20% for loss given default and 10% for the probability of loss. So when you multiply the two, it's effectively a 2% of the portfolio is what they provide for.
Right.
So if you have a $100 million portfolio, what you are expected to provide is a mere $2 million. But the issue is, if you probably reprofile and avoid any impending default, we are probably these local banks will probably have a better chance than impending default, because if there is an eventual default, this 2% will probably jump immediately to 50%.
Right. So, Mr. Tyagaraja, there is a public notion right now that is going around on social media that in the event we restructure our debt, we won't be able to open LCs, and perhaps our own credit cards and debit cards will not be accepted in overseas markets.
That is already
that
happening, Shamit. That is already happening.
Okay.
Because if you speak to any average person, I'm sure if you talk to Vish with his members in the chamber, you will, when I hear this daily, we have customers, whether there are parents trying to send fees for their students,
right,
for education institutions who are delivering degree programs in Sri Lanka or with foreign universities, whether people want to open letters of credit, however important they are, whether it's for essential goods or for non-essential goods, for repayment of any form of, even for people who have their foreign currency here, which they want to send outside to a beneficiary. Today, either they have to wait in long queues. It's not readily available. They just can't go to a bank.
And then open the LCs of transfer the money
because
to
if
another
that
country.
is the case, we will not be here discussing this.
Right. Suresh, now, if you look at, you all were very modest, not to blame any government or any government in power or in play.
I blamed all governments.
Yeah, that's what you said. You're very modest for not just pointing the finger at one respective government. You said it has predominantly happened over the years, and that is why we are in this situation at the moment. Well, let's take a look at the last 15 to 20 years of the governance structure in Sri Lanka. We went ahead. Look at Sri Lankan Airlines for that matter. During the Rajapaksa regime, Sri Lankan Airlines was amalgamated with Emirates. The company was doing so well. Because of one egocentric issue that took place, the government decided to move out of that partnership. Today, Sri Lankan Airlines is making losses over losses. Is one of the strategic management enterprises in the country that is making huge losses, and that is adding to the burden of the debt crisis in the country at the moment. Then look at the southern airport and the south port. We had to give it back to the Chinese because we couldn't afford it. So, egocentric projects that were undertaken by respective governments, especially the Rajapaksa administration, are they to be blamed for this crisis at the moment?
So Shamir, if you were to borrow on any to build up an asset whose revenue streams and profit streams are not in line with the at least with the tenure of the loans themselves, yeah, I mean, you will end up in some kind of trouble, and I think we are seeing the result of that. Whether it is Sri Lankan Airlines, or whether it is the losses of the CPC, or whether it is losses of the Transport Board, or whatever, you know, this is why I spoke of that financial discipline. Organizations need to be sustainable, they need to be run in a particular way. Even countries need to have a disciplined financial system in place. Otherwise, you are going to end up in trouble. And you know what I was alluding to is that the successive governments have brought us very close to the edge of the cliff. And since I think since Easter Sunday 2019, right up to now, we've got even closer to the cliff. I mean, that is the reality that we are facing.
Because when there was the 52-day government which was in power during the Maitripal administration, also we lost a few $1 billion as a result of that crisis as well, isn't it?
Any kind of crisis which conveys an impression of a lack of stability in a country will lead to trouble.
No, but if you look at, Suresh, if you look at the past, we were not relying on ISBs. This is a new trend. This took place probably 15 to 20 years ago.
Less than that.
Less than that. So it's a new trend. So if you look at the last 10 years, who was in power?
Yeah. Shamir, the move into the international financial market was driven by the fact that Sri Lanka migrated from being a underdeveloped country into a lower middle income country. Anura, that's what it was, right?
Right. Okay.
So then you lose access to concessional funding, to concessional finance, which is what we relied on previously. Okay. So when you lose that, and when you're still running fiscal deficits and when your current account is in deficit, you've got to bridge that balance and you got to bridge that gap. And where do you get that money from? That's when you go into the international financial market. So the underlying fundamental reason why Sri Lanka is where Sri Lanka is because we've had these chronic twin deficits, right? That's fundamentally the reason. And yes, the Easter Sunday attacks, the tax cuts that came a few months thereafter and the pandemic that came a few months thereafter, those drove us closer to the edge. But the underlying fundamental reason is these chronic twin deficits that this country has run.
Mr. Govindasamy, on the tax cuts specifically, we know that they were with many people, they were quite popular because, I mean, the reality is who wants to pay taxes, right? Last year on the program, we had the chair of the Advocata Institute, Mr. Murtaza Jaffarji, who was saying that, in Sri Lanka, what we have is essentially a regressive tax regime, because while your income tax proportions might be progressive in name, when you consider the fact that almost 90% of your tax revenue comes from indirect taxes, the poor and the middle class are bearing a disproportionate burden of the government's revenue collection. In that background, do you feel that organizations like the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce are doing enough when it comes to influencing the government on their tax policy?
I think so, because I think every budget, the Ceylon Chamber makes a very, very concerted effort in making proposals, especially when it comes to tax. And I don't think the Ceylon Chamber has ever gone to a government and said reduce tax on anything, if at all, right? We have never gone and stood in front of any government and said we would like you to reduce this or reduce that. We have asked for fair taxing. We have asked for a taxing method that is sustainable. We have asked for taxes that can, make sense as to where it's going, the tax rupees to be, accounted for. So I think Ceylon Chamber has been very, very progressive when it comes to working with governments and, making governments heard when it comes to tax policy.
Do you think that the government should, while also looking at maybe going in for debt restructuring, that they should also seriously consider simultaneously broadening the tax net and in fact making our tax regime, tax collection regime actually in reality more progressive?
We have already made that request. We made that request to the government saying that, one, the tax net has to be increased, and also, in I think 2019, I'm sure it was done in good faith of reducing income taxes, etc. But things have changed drastically from when that decision was made to now. So again, at the last budget, we did say it is okay for you to go back, and to have the old tax rates. So those recommendations were made. I mean,
but given the current cost of living, which I don't think people are willing to pay exorbitant taxes right now.
No, not indirect taxes. We are not talking about indirect taxes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Ekanayaka, since you are an advocate of going in for a debt restructure regime, now, when you go in for a debt restructure regime, the austerity that would bring, the impact that it would have on public welfare programs, the poorest of the poor, like some of the beneficiaries, for example. When you consider that potential impact, we saw it happen when Greece needed to be bailed out. It was the poorest of the poor ended up going to the streets against those austerity measures. And in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, this was very evident. It was, again, the poor and the middle classes that seemed to be, or that appeared to be at least, shouldering a disproportionate amount of the burden. When you see, is it possible that the central bank, the monetary board and the governor of the central bank and those in charge of the finances of this country are thinking of the concerns of the poor and middle classes of the country?
I'm sure they are thinking of the poor and the middle classes, but the problem is.
But are they thinking of the interests of the bondholders over the citizens?
It seems so, but we don't have any information to say definitively. That's the case. One may infer in that way. But going back to your question, without debt restructuring, if the country comes to a grinding halt because you have run out all your reserves, you don't have enough reserves now to import the essentials. Who suffers most? Right? So what debt restructuring does is give you time to bring the situation under control without collapsing. Now, earlier, Shamir, I want to get there, is Shamir posed this question to Deva as to why would the lenders want their debts restructured? So my answer to that is, if there's no restructuring, they will not get anything. They get nothing. So it's far better
to get something,
to go for a restructuring and suffer some loss, either in terms of coupon rate or a haircut on the principal amount or whatever, or extended payments.
Dr. Ekanayake,
Right.
the chairman
so
of
to complete the story,
sorry, quick.
in a situation like this, debt restructuring is a win-win all around. You know, the country's economy won't come to a grinding halt, and in the slide anyway people suffer. That is something we see every day. And on the other hand, lenders have an opportunity to get something. There's clarity in the marketplace. Not only investors in financial instruments, but also potential FDI investors, you know, who come and...
So, Dr.
Clarity as to what is likely to happen. Because at the moment, in a situation like this, no one knows what's going to happen. Right?
When you say that, I'm reminded of something my advanced level economics teacher told me. She said in economics, there is no situation where everyone comes out a winner.
When you
Someone
say
is
winner,
suffering.
no, okay, it's against the worst case scenario. You see, the worst case scenario, let me explain again, is we have run out of all our reserves, right? Now we are what's called a run of the river operation, right? That is, only what we get as inflows will be made available for the outflows. So you see, then everybody in the local economy will suffer. Consumers will suffer, businesses will suffer because they can't run their businesses right, and it will have a spiraling, downward spiraling effect, right? Yeah. It goes from bad to worse.
So, Dr. Ekanayake, you spoke about...
So, let me complete, Nadeem, right? So if you restructure your debt, right, and get a payment plan agreed on an agreed time scale, you know, the country doesn't have to go into that downward spiral, right? So the people suffering will not be as bad as it would be otherwise. That's the key point. And then why I say win-win, if it went that way, the lenders don't get anything, right?
Yeah.
But restructuring, they also will get something. Of course, it will be, I mean, the present value of the stream of revenue they get will be less, but better than nothing.
Now the government is boasting, Dr. Ekanayake, about this 3.1 billion US dollars that we have in our reserves at the moment. In your opening remarks, you said that swaps are short term.
Yes.
And this is for a year or so, we have to repay it back.
Yes.
So if that case be the scenario, we are in quite a bad situation, aren't we, Dr. Ekanayake?
Yes. See, this is a point well worth discussing. When we have a long-term problem, right? We have a long-term.
This seems to be window
we
dressing.
can't handle it purely on small, you know, series of small, shorter-term arrangements. You can't do that, right? Because the problem is spread over a long period of time. This, you know, roughly $4 to $6 billion repayments will continue over the next 5 years, right? So now having ad hoc arrangements like swaps are designed to address short-term liquidity issues.
So right now the government...
Not long-term debt piles.
So Deva, you're also joining us via Zoom. So what right now the government should focus is Now they have two options on the table right now. They have the first option being that they will pay our international obligators and make sure that they respect and honor the maturing of the sovereign bonds. And they have the second option where they won't have money for essential items that are needed for the country. Which option should the government choose now? Because based on what you all have told thus far, I'm trying to gather and summarize. What option must the government resort to?
If you take the option of liquidating this debt or settling this debt of 500 million, or effectively a default in asking for a restructure, the latter would give, just to repeat, the time and space for the country to recover and for the people to not undergo the severe hardship that they would otherwise have to undergo. So that restructure, the call for the restructuring should come along with a reform agenda which is robust enough for them to get convinced that yes, this country with this agenda will put its economy right, 3 years, maybe 5 years, and therefore it's worthwhile us giving them the time to do it. That is the prepayment period, the haircuts necessary, or the reduction in the capital, and even the reduction in rates. So those three will come together, and I'm sure there will be other lenders or bilateral, multilateral institutions coming in to help, like the Paris Club members. I recently did one country which went for an IMF program. Right. Because of that, because of the reforms that they adopted, France alone wrote off $4.2 billion.
So I want to get, you said a very interesting point, Deva, because when reading about the Paris Club, which was very interesting, which was formed in 1956 to support Argentina to get out of the debt crisis. If you look at countries like Iraq, was benefited largely after the 2001 invasion of the US, as well as the coalition forces into Iraq. The Paris Club waived off or gave a support of $10 billion for the Iraqi government to survive. And Paris Club membership includes India and Japan, which are the bilateral lenders for Sri Lanka as well. So why not reach out to a club like the Paris Club for some sort of relief at this point of time if the government does not or want to go to the IMF or the restructuring process? Is that an option available?
I'm sure it is, but I do not know the numbers affecting the Paris Club members in terms of our obligations. But if it's an IMF program, Paris Club would also come to help. Yeah. I'm not saying IMF, any good program, any restructuring of our debt going supported with a robust reform agenda will attract help from Paris Club and many others.
Mr. Rodrigo, if I could ask you, as a former member of the Monetary Board, a few hours, I think about half an hour before this program started, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka was responding to criticisms over halving the country's gold reserves. And they referred to it as prudent reserve management. Do you think that in this situation, because it looks like, I mean, before we can get a haircut, we might actually go bald?
No, I wouldn't say it's just based on gold. If I recall, I think during the premiership of Narasimha Rao, India was so badly down, they had the gold in the country, not in America, stored in an aeroplane to take off. That was the crisis. And then they went into reforms. They allowed foreign investment to come in, they allowed imports to come in, and it transformed the entire economy. It brought in technological advances. And today the automobile industry alone, you know the difference in India, what it is now and what it was. And the whole country took off from there. So,
Nadeem, just on that, it might be worth noting that when we talk about this reserves halving, it's good to, before we pass judgment, to try to understand what is the intent and the object of the halving, for what purpose it was used. If it was a part of what they call portfolio rebalancing of the central bank, that's a strategic decision. But if it has been used for the purposes of defending rupee-dollar rate, for example, at this stage, or to settle
the CBSL's explanation was to manage liquidity.
Okay, so it's important to see what they exactly meant by liquidity. Is it to manage the dollar liquidity? If it's portfolio rebalancing as part of liquidity, it's a different thing. So it's important to see what purpose. Because if it was to convert and then settle something, then of course we can question the rationale of it. But if it was portfolio rebalancing, it's something quite different.
Mr. Tyagaraja, so the chairperson of Beta Research, Nishan Dimel, Dr. Nishan Dimel, in a recent interview had said that, you know, this hurried build-up of forex reserves he's been one of the most vocal proponents of going in for debt restructuring. And he said that, you know, the hurried build-up of forex reserves to pay off ISBs in this way is not a sustainable solution. And he actually made a very stark prediction that by mid-2022, reserves will be down to zero if we continue in this way. Do you agree with that assessment? Could we be down to zero by mid-2022?
So it depends on the assumptions taken. I believe we yet lack clarity. We lack clarity. As Anura said, I think it was at 1.6 or 7 in November, and now it has gone up to about 3.1, 3.2. It is believed that in one of the published reports in November, there was a mention that the 1.5 swap was not accounted for at that stage, but that asterisk is not mentioned in December, so one may presume that now that has been taken into accounting. But the question we yet don't know, and perhaps the central bank should probably give the public some clarity whether this 1.5, if it has been taken into the reserves, is it without any restrictions? Because if it is with restrictions, then one has to ask yourself, is it really going to achieve the purpose of shoring up and settling our foreign exchange problem? If it is not, then we are back to square one.
Mr. Tyagaraja, with your experience in the banking sector for a prolonged period of time, if the US dollar against the rupee is to be floated, where would it end at?
So you look at, during good times when there was when these challenges were not there, and when the dollar rupee reflected a reasonable demand and supply, the curve, what they call the curve, always had a differential of probably 3-4 rupees. But today we hear around us anything between 30 to 40 rupees, right? And one has to ask ourselves, why is this 30 or 40 rupees being quoted? Because if people believe that the fair price is 200, then we will not have problems of only having 370 million of inward remittances coming as opposed to 700 million 12 months ago. We will not have the problem of these exporters who are supposed to generate around $1.5 million of month every month. The stuff actually coming back into the country. There shouldn't be that problem, and you and I should not have the problem about scratching our heads about going out and finding $1,000 or $10,000 to send at a fair market price. That should not be the case. But because that is still an issue, despite whatever is said, there is obviously a disconnect between the market players, those are the banks who are actually dealing in foreign exchange as the agent of the central bank, and the actual policy framework. So that's point one. The second point I would like to also highlight here is, we are told that there was a direction which came through the Monetary Board, I believe, about this conversion of 25%. Now, again, I think it's good to understand the philosophy of whether we are on what we call a managed float or on a free float. I think, from my understanding is the current framework is that the central bank gives a range to the banks and say you ought to maintain or trade the currencies within that broad framework. And when you get to the edge of the two ranges, then either stock of dollars is provided to meet the demands if it cannot meet within that band, or one has to really look and see as to what one has to do to relax that band to reflect the true price. But what is today happening is not that. What I believe, from what we understand, what is happening is more moral suasion. So the question is that sustainable, or should it be the market which should determine the true price?
Right. So, Vish, interestingly, now we're talking about not having essential items in the long run if we don't restructure our debt and if we don't have a way to move forward and have a proper mechanism in place. Now, you represent the private sector of Sri Lanka. Has any of the importers come to you directly and told you that we are facing a crisis at the moment? We can't bring down pharmaceutical products, we can't bring down medicine, we can't bring down food. We are having a problem right now in the market. Has any of the importers come and spoken to you about it?
Yeah, I mean, importers have in different segments of importers, and they have their own associations as well, have lobbied with the Ceylon Chamber, and we have again taken it up with the government, the finance ministry, etc. And wherever possible, they have made exemptions, especially for essential goods, to make sure the funding is available. But it's not like on normal course of business, you see. So the banks have to decide what is important and what is not important, and what can wait, and what can wait a little longer versus what needs to be paid immediately. So there's a lot of juggling that the bankers have to do today to make sure that the essential goods keep coming in. At the same time, some of the raw materials are having a serious issue, especially packaging material in all industries right across. It's an issue because finished goods may be okay, but some of the finished goods, to finish the goods, you need packing material or other raw material. So those are having issues.
Let's make it as simple as possible, Vish, for our viewers to understand. If we continue like this, come April, won't we have money in the country to survive or bring down imports? Because we are an import-driven economy.
I think things will get difficult. I mean, there's no question about it. I can't see, unless of course the swap agreements with India and China materialize. From what I understand, the swap agreement with India is going to allow us to bring down essential food items and medicine. So that will ease the cost somewhat into food and medicine, right? And I think some 400 million odd is to allow us for fuel. So if that is there, it will, I think our fuel bills are around $400 million a month, if I'm right. So it will allow us to roll over for a month or two. So I can't put a date and say April it will become difficult or more, but it will, spiral down eventually.
Because when you have elderly people in your household, they would want medicine, which is one of the very basic essentials as far as surviving is concerned. So are you trying to say that there is a danger to even bring down medicine at the moment?
No, I didn't say that. I said they are making effort to make sure the essential food items and medicines will be given the utmost priority to make sure that doesn't happen. But when you do that, the other things will suffer because you're giving most priority to make sure there is food and medicine at all times. So the other things will, obviously will have to take a back seat.
Because Vish, you know how the export industry works. At least 60 to 70% of the materials are brought down from countries like China, India, Germany, so on and so forth. So are you trying to say because of this problem that we are faced at the moment, that even the export industry, which is giving significant amount of dollars to the reserves and strengthening or bolstering the country's economy, is also under threat?
Well, the export industry, as long as they can have their dollars in, they can pay out the dollars to bring the raw materials. I think that has been cleared. There was an issue initially that has been somewhat cleared, but there will be some items that they procure locally as well. Not 100% of the export industry depends on bringing. So they have to have some local products as well. I mean, it won't be smooth sailing, let me put it that way, right?
Right.
So it's not as, business as usual. There will be difficulties as we go along. So if there are power cuts, if there is no fuel, those are all difficulties, right? It adds cost. When you have to run a generator, it adds cost.
Because right now, Vish, we are going to the international community to the begging bowl. We spoke to the Nigerian High Commissioner to India and Sri Lanka, who was in Sri Lanka a couple of weeks ago. We went with the begging bowl, asking whether Nigeria can supply fuel for us. Then we went to Dubai, again with the begging bowl, asking whether Dubai can provide us fuel. And we saw recently a Twitter statement that was made by the Minister of Energy, Uday Gammampilla, who went on to say that if we don't have money, if we don't have US dollars by the 15th of this month, we are going to be in trouble. So this is alarming, isn't it? Where does it put us? Are we moving towards a Venezuela? Are we moving towards a Lebanon?
I think, Samir, this is what we have been all saying here. We have to make sure our reserves are kept, our inflows are kept intact, and to do that, our debt payments have to be restructured. And you heard Deva say it again and again, we need to have a serious reform agenda put forward.
Right. So you say, Deva and Vish are articulating the fact that we have to have a reform agenda, we need to have a credible plan. Suresh, what is this plan? What does this plan entail?
So before we talk about the plan, I want to go back to Nadeem's teacher, economics teacher. He fundamentally what he said was that somebody is going to lose, right? Yeah. So now, guys, we have a situation at this moment in time, and there are three types of actors, okay, who are looking at the limited pool of funds that Sri Lanka has, right? And who are these three types? So firstly, we have the citizens of Sri Lanka, right? Secondly, we have the businesses of Sri Lanka. And when I'm talking about the businesses of Sri Lanka, I'm not really talking about, their cash flows or their profits, but I'm talking more about the importance of keeping the wheels of business turning, because they provide employment, they provide taxation, they give growth to the economy, and so on and so forth, right? So that's the second actor. And the third actor is the bondholders, okay? Now, let's ask ourselves, amongst these three actors, which one of them would Nadeem's economic teacher want to lose, right? Is it the Sri Lankan citizen? Is it the Sri Lankan business people or the businesses? Or is it the bondholders, right? I think that is a fundamental question that we are faced with at this moment in time, because what we have is a very limited pool of funds, and these funds need to be distributed amongst these three, right? So at this, we are all aware, right? It's not a secret. Today we are short of gas, which is why we see the gas queues. We are short of milk food, which is why we see the milk food, the queues for milk food, right? Now, like Shamir just said, the minister in charge of petroleum has said we might run out of cash for petroleum. The CEB from today has announced power cuts, 2-hour power cuts, right? So fundamentally what we are saying so far, okay, is that we are going to tell the Sri Lankan people that they need to tighten their belts, okay, because we want to pay the bondholders 100%. That's fundamentally what we are saying. Now, so we got to ask ourselves, is which one of these three segments do we want, should be winning? And in action, is that the group that is actually winning?
But don't you think, Suresh, that this notion of tightening the belt should come from the political hierarchy first? Because if you look at it, the last few months, most of the ministers are overseas. One of the state ministers contracted COVID when he was in the UK. I don't know the reason that he went there. That's a different story altogether. But are they setting the precedent for the people to tighten their belts and move forward?
Quite frankly, Shamir, at this moment, I mean, you know, that's a relative, I mean, it's in the bigger picture, that's not really a fantastic amount of money, right? But at this moment in time, I think what all of us are saying is that the people whom we should be asking to really tighten their belt are the bondholders. Right?
Okay.
And that money should be released for the Sri Lankan people to get their essentials and for the Sri Lankan businesses to be able to get their raw materials so that they can keep production running, right? And you know, it's not just about gas and it's just not about milk powder. But if, for example, we can't get spare parts down, okay, equipment in hospitals won't function, right? So now this is in addition to medicines being short, okay? Buses may not function, and if buses don't function because there are no spare parts, how do people get to work, right? Now, Vish might get to work in his car, but if the guy on his production line can't get to work because the bus is not working, the company doesn't function, right? Then the taxes don't get paid. What happens to the employees? So we are looking at this, you know, we are looking at this scenario, right? And we are really not taking action to prevent that scenario happening. So Shamir, going back to the question that you asked, you know, you were talking about a plan. What's the plan?
Yeah.
So I see that there are two types of plans that we need.
Yeah, but before coming to the plan, Suresh, I'll give you some minutes to articulate about the plan as well. The question is now, the problem that the people are facing at the moment is mixed messages or the mixed signals that are being projected by the government, Suresh. Now, a few months ago, when this debt crisis was taking place and when the fertilizer issue was at a peak, there was a government minister who went on the media and said, if you're having 3 meals a day, start having 2. Then we saw the manner in which how the governor of the central bank as well as the finance minister are steadfast about not going to the IMF for a restructuring program. However, yesterday, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who is also the brother of the finance minister, who is also the brother of the prime minister, goes to the Chinese foreign minister and asks for help to restructure debt. What is the message or what is the signal the government is trying to create?
No, you're right. I think I'm very glad that you spotted the fact that the president had asked the Chinese foreign minister to restructure the debt, because if he can ask the Chinese foreign minister to restructure the debt, we should be able to also go to the bondholders and say, let's restructure the debt, right? I agree with you on that, right? And I can't remember this minister who said, you know, guys have 2 meals a day rather than 3. But frankly, we should be telling the bondholders have 2 meals rather than 3 and not telling the Sri Lankan people. I think that's, so this is where I'm coming from, right? We have a limited pool of resources, and I think it's our first responsibility to make sure that the people of the country have their essentials, right? Rather than tell Wall Street, we will pay you 100%, right? So that's where I'm coming from.
Right. So Suresh, also now, a few months ago when we had Murtaza Jafarji on the show, he said that we are now in the ICU. We need to take treatment immediately. What is your opinion about this statement? Do you think we are in the ICU at this very moment, or we have some time to restructure our debt and get out of it?
No, so if you look at some numbers, I think you asked the question from Thea, I believe it was whether we'll run out of reserves by mid of this year, right?
Yes.
If you look at the numbers, I think we have what's called predetermined outflows of about 1.8 billion over the next 2 months, and that includes the 500 million ISB, right? And we have usable reserves of about 1.6 billion. I'm excluding this 1.5 because from what we understand, that is not convertible into dollars, right? So we have a usable reserve of about 1.6 and we have predetermined outflows of about 1.8, right? So reserves insufficient to meet the predetermined outflows. So will we actually hit a 0 at some point? As things stand, unless there is some fresh infusion of cash into the system from somewhere or the other, it looks very likely that that's going to happen, okay?
Suresh, now recently making a statement, the president said that I can get the people, hold them by their necks and tell them to go and use organic fertilizer and that chemical fertilizer won't be given. What if the business community want to step up and tell the government, look here, we are in a crisis. We have to think about the people of the nation. We have to make sure that we are moving in the right direction in terms of the country's economy. Can't we hold the government to account and tell them, guess what? Act right now, because you are putting the people's lives in danger. Can't the business community do that?
So isn't that what we are doing right now?
Right now, no. I mean, no, but at least have more aggression. Now we are talking about the debt restructuring program during the last 2 to 3 days. The business community came out. The business community, now we are making a platform for individuals like you all, who are very learned gentlemen, to come and speak out and tell the government, look here, we are on the wrong track. Get onto the right path. So can't the business community do it? Can't the people do it? Can't the people force the government to move to a situation or a mechanism of that sort?
Yeah, but we can't push people to take extra legal measures, Shamir. You know, that leads to all kinds of other challenges.
Right.
So I think the role that we can play is to give our perspective and put our thoughts and ideas on the table. At the end of the day, somebody else is in the position of making decisions, and they need to make the decisions which they believe are to be right. And we presume that they are looking at a wide range of advice that they must be getting from all over, including listening to people like us. So we presume that they are listening to a much broader segment of society and taking decisions which they believe to be right. We are giving you our perspective.
Right. So I'll come back to you, Suresh, on the solutions. But we have just got a message or a question for Dr. Ekanayake from one of our viewers. Shouldn't Dr. Ekanayake and the rest of the panelists demand accountability for government declining the final tranche of the IMF External Fund Facility and the IMF Rapid Release COVID Financial Facility, which many of other developing nations availed of without delay? Doesn't it show government's utter disregard for the fate of its citizens? Don't they think it is outrageous? Don't you think it's outrageous?
Good question, and a fair question too. It appears that government seriously thought and still thinks perhaps that it's possible to look after the welfare of the citizenry and the interests of the nation without going outside. And you can see various statements from in different policy statements, sentences, paras, alluding to that kind of thinking, and it's a point of view, right? And the issue is whether right now we have time and space to find solutions to this dollar crisis, if I may call it, not having sufficient foreign currency to A, to fund the necessary imports, and B, to settle debt, right? So whether there are internal solutions. So that's why we are here. And by the way, I have to take object to one of the things you said earlier. Private sector, including us, have been talking about this for quite a while. Of course, now when things are getting, if I may call, hotted up, right, we get more attention. So we've been very consistent,
right,
on the need to restructure.
Right.
the debt.
Understandable, Dr. Ekanayake. So, Dr. Ekanayake, now, what is driving the central bank to take such a decision? Isn't it ego? Because if you look at when Fitch Ratings downgraded Sri Lanka to CCC, the central bank issues a statement. Without finding a solution to the problem at hand, the central bank refers to the roadmap that was issued by the governor of the central bank when he took over office. Isn't this a power of ego that we're talking about? Just come down from the pedestal and let's talk sense. Isn't this the problem at hand? Isn't it about ego?
Or is it about a point of view? or philosophy. You see, you can have a philosophy which says end of the day resource allocation has to be primarily determined by market forces. That's one philosophy. And you can also have a philosophy saying no, resource allocation must be primarily decided upon by the government priorities, right? And what the promises the government has given to the philosophies. Those are positions. So I would not attach these differences to an individual's ego or thought process.
Let me ask you a simple question,
Yes.
Dr. Ekanaga. Let's be very open-ended. Just give me a yes or no. During the last 2 years, has this government done a good job? Give me a yes or no.
I don't think it has done a good job.
It has not done a good job.
No.
So what is the resolve that we have?
No,
at the moment?
it's arising from a particular thought process. It's arising from a philosophy which does not trust markets sufficiently, believes that state can do better than market in terms of allocating resources and looking after the welfare of the people.
Right,
That's the key. Right?
So we just got a viewer asking me to pose the same question that I posed to Dr. Ekanaika about whether or not the government has done well in the last 2 years. So in respect and honoring the view of the viewer, I'm going to pose the same question to the 4 other panelists as well. Has the government done a good job during the last 2 years in managing the country's economy? So let's start off with Mr. Tyagaraja.
In terms of the economy itself, I think given that it has also inherited its own share of problems, it could have done much better.
Right. Suresh.
I don't think any government in this country has done well for the economy, including this government. So no government.
Right. Vish?
I think given the circumstances, I don't think they could have done any better.
Deva?
It's not an yes and no answer. There have been governments that have done well before. I disagree with Suresh on that. I don't want to go to specific periods, but some periods they have done very well.
Deva, I need to ask you this question. If I don't ask you this question, then everyone is going to point the finger at me. Which government has done better?
The 2001 to 2004, or the 3 years, that's the time I was involved in the central bank also. 2003, the rupee declined against the dollar just by 1 cent. I'm not judging the performance of the economy by that alone, but that is one indicator. And interest rates came down on their own because the government stopped borrowing from the state banks. 50 odd billion rupees at that time, which was quite a lot. SOEs were asked to pay back all their overdrafts, and it was done. Banks were flush with funds, and they started dropping the interest rates. There were several other indicators. What you call the unemployment went down, inflation was very low, and because the interest rates were low, people started investing money. They could afford to. And also, rightly or wrongly, there was a peace agreement at that time. We don't have to go into the reasons as to why the northern rebels agreed to it, but there was a peace agreement. So that period was very good, and I have heard, I can't remember this when I was very young maybe, during MDH Javadana's time, there were 2 years of surplus in there's a budget surplus. So I don't agree that all the governments have failed.
Right.
In running the economy.
So with your permission, Deva, I need to get back to Suresh. Suresh.
I was expecting that, sir.
All right. Are you in agreement with Deva?
No, I mean, Mr. Rodrigo is looking at it from a particular perspective, and I respect that. But I look at it from a different perspective, Shamir.
Yeah.
I look at Sri Lanka versus the comparator countries and see the progression that Sri Lanka has made versus those countries have made. I'm also reminded of the fact that you take some simple things, okay? Like take the public transport system, right? Take our power system. Take the fact that almost every year we have floods across the country, right? These are some very fundamental things which need attention, and they've not got the attention that they deserve. Today, a female cannot comfortably go in public transport, right? So when you look at indicators of that nature, right, I think it goes beyond whether economy grew by 5% or 6%, right? I'm not saying that 5% and 6% is bad, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying there are lots of things that need to be attended to, and it all depends what your benchmarks are. And for me, the benchmarks really are the comparator countries and not what we were yesterday, right? So when I look at the comparator countries, I can't say that Sri Lanka has done well. Yes, certainly we have done better than what we were before, but have we done well? The answer is no.
So Suresh, I recollect many years ago during the Sirma Bandaranaike era, the country was really going through a very tough time. There was no rice to eat, people had to resort to eating taro roots, there were no clothes to wear. Right now we are seeing the hallmarks of it somewhat. You see long queues at gas stations, you see no sugar, no dal, no rice, and the country is being governed by individuals who hold monopolies in the market. Like the rice mill owners tell the government, this is what you should do, the government resorts to that action. Where are we heading as a nation? Haven't we lost the plot?
So that's where the plan comes into play.
Right, yes.
Okay, so, and I see it in two stages, in two phases really. So there is a longer term plan that needs to be put into place, and then there is a short term plan, okay? And if you give me a few seconds to explain.
Of course, sir.
The longer term plan needs to address those fundamental issues that I spoke out earlier, which is the fiscal deficit and which is the deficit in the current account on the external front, right? So some of the things, these are not everything, but some of the things that we need to attend to would be, for example, we need to get our exports up, right? And I would, we are all business people here, we like KPIs. So from an export perspective, I would say we need to get to a minimum of 100% of imports as exports, right? We need to bring at least 4 to 5% of our GDP in as FDI each year, okay? I would think that we should be targeting around 5 million tourism arrivals on an annual basis, right? But these are things that are not going to happen in 3 months or 6 months or 1 year even. These are things that will take maybe 2-3 years to happen. So take something like FDI. To attract the right amount of FDI, you need ease of doing business, right? And ease of doing business means that you need to make certain changes to the regulatory system, for example. So what I'm saying is these are not going to happen in a short period of time. So in order to give us the space that we need to work on the long-term plans, we need to have a short-term plan in place, right? And that short-term plan, when you look at the fact that our expenses have been more than our income, okay, and when we know that our outflows are greater than our inflows on the external side, we have to bridge these gaps, and to bridge these gaps, we need finance, okay? And at this moment in time, Sri Lanka is locked out of the international financial markets because our reserves are low, right? So the first thing to do is to get our reserves back up to at least 3 to 4 months of imports. That would be like the minimum, right? So this is one of the reasons we are saying protect your reserves, right? To protect your reserves, go restructure your debt, okay? So that's the first thing, restructure your debt. Number 2, prepare a plan, prepare a credible plan which has the acceptance of your creditors and which has the acceptance of some of the multilateral agencies. By multilateral agencies, particularly the IMF, because it's good to get them to underwrite your plan, right? Go to them, get the funding from them because they give you long-term funding, they give you concessionary funding, right? And if they do underwrite, you also get access to the global financial markets, which then you can start borrowing from them as well. Okay, and then you implement your plan. So these would be the fundamental steps that we need to take, right? Have the long-term plan, but to be able to get to your long-term plan, you need space in the short term. Do these steps to ensure that you survive in the short term, so that you can then implement your long-term plan.
So does any of the gentlemen have a supporting thought? Yeah, Mr. Tyagaraja.
Yes, I tend to agree with Suresh, but I would like to add a couple of riders to that.
Yes.
Boosting exports is important, but not just primary exports. I think we have repeatedly spoken about the need for value addition. That I think is a very, very important thing. And the second thing, as an island nation, one cannot only talk about exports in its entirety without coordinating with imports. So it has to be an overall trading. It's a trading nation. So one has to look at this whole set of reforms, including the review and liberalization of tariffs and para-tariffs. I know at one time there was a movement which took place a few years ago, I believe. Whether it is still status quo, I'm not sure. But I think if we are to compete not through protection, I think one needs to look at that as an open economy to bring that. Secondly, and the third issue I think is, if we are to, I think the Suresh's thing about preserving reserves is important, but it's not only preserving and also boosting. Boosting has to be through sustainable means, not by shortcuts. And that's where, again, I know we are trying to detach this with these ratings. Why did we go out of the ratings? Because the mechanism, the fundamentals of rating agencies doesn't look at yesterday. They look at tomorrow and see, is there sense and is there a viability in what you're trying to do. So I think that is also important, because as he says, if we are to get back into the markets, one cannot get back into the markets in isolating ratings. One has to also get that into perspective.
Right. Any supporting or yes?
Yeah, I wanted to.
You can oppose those thoughts as well.
I think so I agree with everything that Suresh said, but I also think, echoing what Mr. Tyagaraja said, also is to get into more service-oriented export.
Right.
You know, because we cannot, as a small nation, build huge infrastructure, right? So we need to get into the whole finance world, digital world. I mean, those type of exports are, you know, and I think we need to really exploit that, especially with the big country like India around us and even the other SAARC countries. There's a lot of scope. If we work really hand in glove, we can get that export dollars coming in. And we need to move away from being dependent on the tourism. I mean, now tourism has come to a challenge in so many ways. If a tsunami comes,
and Omicron
you
and
know,
all that,
if a pandemic comes, you know, so many times we have been hit. So, you know, it's a good thing to have, but I think we can't just depend only on that as our main source of foreign exchange.
Right.
So we need to develop other things, and we can't also do, I mean, we can't suddenly become an aeroplane building country. That's not it. Right? So we need to go into things that we know how to do very quickly without building big infrastructure.
It's like a few years ago, the government tried to bring down Volkswagen. that's a completely different story altogether. Yes, Dr.
Yeah, Shamir, I think when everything what was said before me are put together, I agree. One element I would like to stress is for the last 15-20 years, we have had a policy framework which in fact was biased against export of goods and services. For example, if your exchange rate is overvalued, then what happens is it favors imports as against exports, goods and services. Right? So we have to get that right, and we have to learn from the experience of particularly the Southeast Asian countries, and right now even Bangladesh, right? How we have to start asking how can we join the global or regional value chains. It's not about trying to do everything at home. So it's still outward looking.
Right.
Thirdly, we got to believe more in this planning. We got to be more skill and talent, human capital based as against physical resources, including infrastructure.
Right.
Right? And with those elements brought into all what was said, we have a very good chance of coming out of this situation within a short period of time, 3 to 4 years. But to get there, we need to restructure. Right?
So, Deva, you want to add anything to those thoughts?
I want to add something important.
Yeah.
I agree with Suresh.
You agree?
Finally,
Finally, you can come into a consensus about those thoughts. But I want to ask you a question, Deva, before I move into a short commercial break. Must I probably represent the youth of this nation as well. Nadeem, Zeenat, both of them are very young. Must I be worried about the future of this country if the government does not go towards a restructuring program right now? Must I stay in this nation? Can I have faith in this nation? Can I have faith in the governance structure of this nation? Can I do that?
I think I'm a few years at least older than you. I'm 76. I want to stay in this country. I have faith in this country, and I want this country to do well. And to start with, maybe we should restructure the bonds.
So before I go for a short commercial break, I have one more question for Vish. Vish, you said that COVID-19 is a pandemic and the government does not have to blame itself for the problems that we're facing at the moment. But I want to remind you, Vish, that just a few weeks ago, we saw Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa going in a private jet to Tirupati, India. And the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister, who is the son, said that it's been given by a friend, but we don't know the name of the friend who has given the private jet which carried the Prime Minister. Then a few years ago, there was talk about bringing down 200 luxury vehicles for parliamentarians of this nation. Unfortunately, that was reversed by His Excellency President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. But when we see matters like this that has taken place in Sri Lanka, what does it leave us with? I'm thinking about a normal, ordinary man who's not a journalist, not representing the private sector. I'm just an ordinary person. What would I think? What does that give me the right message to have my eggs in this government and think, okay, this government will do well? As Deva said, I want to stay in this nation, I want to carry on this nation, but does it give me confidence when things like this happen?
See, Samir, it's like this. You can't believe everything that you see in a newspaper, right? So unless you know the absolute facts behind what is being said, what is being told, etc., I'm not privy to that information. So I'm not going to make any judgments based on what you just said or what I read in the newspaper, etc. But yes, I think we as citizens, we need to hold governments accountable, right? As voters, we need to hold our governments accountable. That's fundamental, whether it's Sri Lanka or whether any other nation, as long as it's a democratic society, we have to hold our governments accountable and responsible.
But they're taking us in circles, Novish.
Yeah, but you can't give up.
Circles.
You can't give up, Samir, like that. We can't give up.
What is your alternative, Vish, now?
No. So what we are doing is an alternative.
Alternative for this governance in this country.
So
do you see any alternative for the future?
You can't make, that doesn't get you anywhere, right? You have to keep.
What gets us?
But we have to keep on informing whenever they err. We have to tell them that this is wrong, right? And if the people have the voice to say that, I don't think any government
But if
can.
they are not correct in themselves, who are we to say it to?
Well, you
now
have
you
your-
said, Vish, that you all have lobbied so much to the government. They are
and we
listening
will-
to you
and
but
we
not
will
implementing it.
We will continue to do that.
But they will listen to you, they will give you meetings, they will say that they are listening to you, but they will not implement it. So then what happens? Look at the stars, count the stars and wait until the cows go home? Tell me, Vish, I'm asking you.
No. So if one were to give up, then what happens then? You can't give up. So you have to continue your process. It's a process, right? You have to work at it. If one doesn't hear, you make 10 others hear. That's what you do, and that's what a good, association or a chamber does.
The only
right?
hope
We have
is,
to work at
Vish,
it.
just the way that they reversed the ban on the organic fertilizer, they will at least now get the means and the thoughts after the learned gentlemen like you all expressed your opinions about the restructuring, importance of restructuring. At least they will listen to that. Let's hope so. So we're going for a short commercial break. When we come back, it's the final round. Each speaker would give their thoughts about the way forward for Sri Lanka and a solution to the problem that we are faced at the moment. Is debt restructuring the way forward? It's up to you to decide. We're going for a short commercial break. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation. We will be right back.
One disinfectant to keep your hands, home surfaces, electronic devices and personal belongings safe from bacteria, virus and fungi. Sri Lanka's first SLS certified disinfectant, now with lemon fresh and ice pine fresh fragrances. Sun all-purpose disinfectant spray.
තනිව යන්න බෑයි කියන කාරණේද අධ්‍යාපනයේදී මම කියන්නේ ප්‍රධාන වශයෙන් සිදුවෙන දේ.
අපිට රුසියානු සපත්තුව මේ ලංකාවට දාන්න බෑ ඒක ලොකුයි. චීන සපත්තුව සීන සමාජවාදී ඒකත් හරියන්නේ නැහැ. ඒක මේ කකුලට පොඩි. අපි අපේම සපත්තුව මහ ගන්න ඕනේ කියලා.
එක්සත් ජාතීන්ගේ මානව හිමිකම් කවුන්සිලය කියලා කියන්නේ මානව හිමිකම් පිළිබඳව ලෝක පාර්ලිමේන්තුව.
අපි පරිසරය කියන්නේ දෙකක් තිබුණා.
මම ඉස්කෝලේ යන කාලෙත් මේක තුන්වන ලෝකේ රටක්. දැන් මම මැරෙන්න යන කාලෙදි තුන්වන ලෝකේ රටක්.
ආණ්ඩුව රූපාන්තරණය වෙනවා රාජ්‍ය බවට.
එත දෙකේ එත පහේදී තමයි මේ වතු ඔක්කොම නැෂනලයිස් කරේ.
එහෙමයි ධර්මශ්‍රී රට ගැන විතරක් නෙමෙයි මම ගැනත් මම බය වෙලා ඉන්නේ.
අපනයන කවුද කරන්නේ? කවුද විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයට ගියේ? නේ. කවුද අපේ ව්‍යාපාර කරන්නේ? විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයට ගියේ? නේ.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. ජනයා වැඩි වශයෙන් සිටින ස්ථානයන්හි ගැවසීම මගහරින්න. රෝගය ආසාදිත පුද්ගලයන් හමුවීමට නොයන්න. මුහුණ, මුඛය, නාසය සහ ඇස් ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න. අනවශ්‍ය ගමන් බිමන් යෑමෙන් වළකින්න. මුඛාවරණය ඉදිරිපස ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න.
එළියේ හීනියට වහින වැහි පොද මුළු හිතම හිරිවට්ටල දානවා අප්පච්චි.
ඉස්සර මට හිටියේ එක පුතයි දුවල දෙන්නයි. දැන් පුතු 4 දෙනයි දුවල 4 දෙනෙක් ලැබෙනවා.
මේ උඹට පොඩ්ඩක් පුළුවන්ද මේ ලෝකෙට පොඩ්ඩක් ඇවිල්ලා යන්න?
බෑඩ් ටැක්සි කාර් නැත්තම් මැරෙද්ද? ඔය දෙකේම වැඩි වෙනසක් නෑ මල්ලි. ඒක නෙමෙයි. ආවයි හාවි කෝ.
මම පුරුදු වෙනවා. සත්‍යයි.
මම මේ ඔය ළමයින්ගේ හොඳට මේවා කියන්නේ. ඔය ගෑනු ළමයා පන්නගෙන යන වැඩේ නම් හරියන්නේ නෑ.
සුදුහාමිනේ එකපාරටම වෙනස් වුණේ කොහොමද? මේ තරම් ඉක්මනට මේ වගේ ලොකු වෙනසක්
One disinfectant to keep your hands, home surfaces, electronic devices and personal belongings safe from bacteria, virus and fungi. Sri Lanka's first SLS certified disinfectant, now with lemon fresh and ice pine fresh fragrances. Sun all-purpose disinfectant spray.
Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. We start off the final round with Dr. Andre Ekanayake, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Dr. Ekanayake, what is the way forward for Sri Lanka and what is the solution to this problem that we are facing at the moment? Your time starts now.
Thank you, Shamil. To find a solution to the problem, we need to know what caused the problem. What caused the problem are basically the twin deficits which Suresh explained in detail earlier, right? Now, fiscal deficit and the current account deficit. There are different theories about what caused those, but they are all to do with government policy, not the individual ordinary citizens' behavior. So where we are now is the result of inappropriate policy frameworks of successive governments. They're nothing to do with, in my personal view, they're nothing to do with the egos of certain individuals. It's about the ideologies, ideological positions with regard to the political framework and the economic framework within which the country has to be taken forward. It's of no use at this point of time, at a crisis time, to waste our energies pointing fingers at others. What is needed is everybody to agree on what is the immediate priority. So the question right now, the immediate priority is, are we going to protect our citizenry and our economy from a total collapse and chaos? That is the top priority. Answer to the question or the challenge is to immediately engage in a debt restructuring process. This bullet payment for bonds maturing in 18th of January is just one bit of it. It's not the whole story. The key is immediately start debt restructuring. It's better late than never. And then by the time to have a conversation, a dialogue, a series of conversations and consultations on how the economy can be taken forward to the medium to long term, right? So let me stop at that. That's my sort of summary of what we need to do.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andre Ekanayake, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. I now move my attention to yet another former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Rajendra Tyagaraja.
Thanks. I think the need of the hour initially is to put the interest of the citizens before anybody else. I think as Suresh said, there were three groups of stakeholders, but I think the citizens come first. And in that process, need of the hour is certainly to do everything to preserve whatever foreign exchange we have. If we have to engage into a renegotiation, restructuring, so be it, do it. The objective of that is preemptive, precaution, and as a part of that process, build up the reserves. The whole objective of building up the reserves is to also make sure eventually we go back into a positive rating environment, because let us realize that there was a time when we got in from a lower income class into a middle income category. and there's no way we should go back. So if we are to go forward, retaining the rating and returning to the markets is absolutely important. We need to keep our eye on that, and whatever else we do as a part of a capacity building in that 3 or 4 year space, which was discussed in the last 1.5 to 2 hours, can be done. But the overall end game has to be getting back into the markets, but initially preserve what we have at the moment and take care of the interest of the people.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rajan Thiagaraja, a chartered accountant as well as former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. I now move my attention to Deva Rodrigo, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, as well as former member of the monetary board of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka.
I would like you to add that I'm also a chartered accountant.
Yes, okay, of course.
Yes. The need of the hour, I would say, is to get time and space to go up with the reform agenda before the whole economy crashes, causing hardship to everybody, to the people, to the government, and also to the people who have lent us money, the bondholders and others. The reform agenda is very long. I cannot spell it out right here. I didn't think about it clearly enough, but it would certainly involve, as Anura said, getting rid of the budget deficit or getting it down to about 2%. Balance of payments, fix it. There are so many things that we can discuss on that. It is not the right forum for it. Except to say one thing. Our country concentrates a lot on agriculture and manufacturing. I take a slightly different view. If you take the economy of the USA last century, the 20th century, at the beginning of the century, the greatest contribution to the GDP was agriculture. Midway, it became manufacturing. But towards the last quarter of the century, services were way ahead of manufacturing, and agriculture's contribution was only 2%. So I believe the way forward for a modern economy to grow at that rate is not to stick to agriculture, as Mahathir Mohamad once told in Sri Lanka. If you have this piece of land, you can, with agriculture, get so much. With manufacturing, you can get something much more, but with services, you can get enormously more. You may not need space also today. You can work from home. So that emphasis, and we have to relook at the whole thing. It's not only cutting down corruption and waste. It's a lot more how to improve productivity, how to improve the attitudes and values of our people, and getting the politicians to go by be disciplined in the way they themselves behave, because it's not big money, as Suresh said, in the greater scheme of things, but it is the example you set. So to start with all that also, we have to introduce another plank, not tomorrow, but when we get the other things right, education, very important.
Right. Thank you very much, Deva Rodrigo, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, former member of the monetary board of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, and also a chartered accountant. Thank you very much, Deva, for joining us this evening on the show. I now move my attention to Suresh Shah, chartered accountant, as well as the former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you, Shamir. So I think I outlined a bit of a plan, a very broad plan, I know, a few minutes ago, so I won't get into that too much. But just to say that, you know, when our people are standing in the gas queue or when they are standing in the milk food queue, they are not really making a sacrifice on behalf of the country. They are really making a sacrifice on behalf of bondholders. That's fundamentally what it is. And I think we need to make a shift there. We need to preserve the cash that we have so that the people of this country have their essentials on a day-to-day basis, that their standard of living is maintained. And for that, we need to go into a debt restructuring mechanism. It's not just the $500 million that we are talking about, but it's that whole, the entirety of the debt that Anura and the rest of the panel were speaking about earlier. So we need to get into restructuring. You know, there is a fear that restructuring can leave us out of the financial markets for a while. But right now, we are out of the financial markets in any way. So, you know, the consequences of a restructuring will be no different from what we are facing right now. So I think that needs to give us more confidence. So I think, yes, at this moment in time, we need to address the crisis before we do anything else. And the best way of addressing that crisis is to get into a restructuring and subsequently get into an IMF program as well, because that will help with the whole restructuring process also. So I'll stop at that for the moment.
Thank you very much, Suresh, for your thoughts. We now move attention to Vish Govindaswamy, Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce and the Employees Federation of Ceylon, which is also the sitting chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Your final remarks.
Thank you, Samir. It's not easy to come fifth down when the first four batsmen have all scored centuries. I think they've covered everything. But what I want to say is, you know, we can start pointing fingers, who's right, who's wrong. It's not going to help. Let's put Sri Lanka first. I urge all the parties, whether political, etc., come together at a crucial time like this for Sri Lanka. Put all our agendas aside and work together so that we can come with this one reform agenda, one restructuring plan to help the people of Sri Lanka. And then that's the message I want to leave with you today.
Thank you very much. Before I leave the five gentlemen, I have to ask you all one more question. If you all know the answer for this, you can answer. Whose economic theory are we following right now in Sri Lanka? What is the economic theory that we are following in Sri Lanka? Does anyone know the answer?
It's a homegrown theory. But
we'll leave it there.
We'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Rajendran Tyagaraja, a chartered accountant, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, for joining us this evening on the show. Dr. Anureka Naika, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, for joining us on Face the Nation tonight. Suresh Shah, chartered accountant, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Vish Govindaswamy, current chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, as well as the Employees Federation of Ceylon, as well as Deva Rodrigo, chartered accountant, as well as former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce and the former member of the Monetary Board of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Have we been thrown from the frying pan into the fire yet? Or are we waiting until disaster strikes? The government has a lot to think right now. The government must ensure, as the five speakers rightly pointed out, that the future of the government as well as the people is in their hands at the moment, and it is right for them to act in the best interests of the citizenry of this resplendent island nation. With that, I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do, while thanking Nadeem as well as Zeenath for joining us on Face the Nation tonight. A leader is one who knows the way, goes the way, shows the way, and also leads the way. Take care and good night.